The radio screamed with static, cutting through the cold night like a knife. Boots splashed through thick mud as flares tore the darkness apart. Paintings shattered walls and twisted metal in harsh white light. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thudded, deep and unrelenting, shaking the ground beneath her. A young woman pressed herself against a crumbling stone wall. Gripping the radio handset so tightly her knuckles went white. "Command, do you copy?" She whispered, but only silence answered. Then came the footsteps. Not friendly, not hesitant, just deliberate, closing in through the smoke. She turned and froze. The shadow emerging from the haze wasn't firing. It was waiting. No one would ever learn her name. No report would capture what happened next. And every woman captured after her would be given the same chilling warning. If you survive, never talk about it. And then something impossible happened. Eastern Europe. Late 1944. The war was collapsing inward on itself. German forces were retreating along broken roads, supply lines were severed, and entire units were being overrun. Among them were female auxiliary operators, medical assistants. Intelligence clerkswomen, trained to support the war effort, not to survive capture. Officially, their roles were non-combat, but unofficially, they carried maps, codes, and secrets that could shift the course of operations. Captured male soldiers were processed, questioned, or exchanged, but the women faced a different fate. Their records disappeared. Their testimonies vanished, and any files that existed were quickly sealed. Commanders issued quiet directives. If captured alive, say nothing. Not even years later, yet no one explained why. The stakes weren't just personal, they were strategic. Lives, secrets, and even the fragile remnants of retreating armies hung in the balance. And the real threat lurking behind the chaos? It hadn't even appeared yet. Asterisk. It began with a transmission that shouldn't have existed. A few hurried, static-filled words cutting through the chaos of retreating units. The message was fragmented, almost indecipherable, yet chilling in its simplicity. Female operators secured. Await instructions. That single line should never have reached anyone. According to official logs, no woman was stationed in that sector. No unit reported a capture, and no follow-up communication ever appeared. Within minutes, the situation spiraled. Field reports were rewritten, witnesses suddenly became unavailable, and one officer made an unscheduled trip to headquarters, returning pale, silent, and clearly shaken. The air itself seemed to thicken with unspoken danger. Then, another transmission arrived, shorter, colder, more deliberate. Do not debrief. Do not document. Do not ask. The words carried an authority that went beyond military protocol, as if some invisible hand were ensuring that certain truths would never see the light of day. Who had sent the messages? And why specifically mention her? On the ground, units hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat, while commanders across the region scrambled to reconcile contradictory orders. Every passing second seemed to stretch into eternity, because the next 90 minutes filled with tension, confusion, and the weight of secrecy would determine whether anyone would survive this encounter. And whether the world would ever hear what had happened to those captured alive? The question hung in the air like smoke. What exactly had happened after the capture? And why were the women warned never to speak of it? Asterisk, the night was alive with chaos, but not the kind that could be explained by maps or strategy. Somewhere on the mud-choked roads of Eastern Europe, artillery fire punctured the air in irregular bursts, shaking trees, walls, and men alike. The smell of cordite, wet earth, and smoke combined into a thick haze that clung to the lungs of every retreating soldier. Units collided blindly in the dark, confused by contradictory orders, some advancing while others fell back into crossfire. The flash of rifles cutting through the shadows. Amid this, the female auxiliaries moved like ghost operators, medics, and clerks who had been trained for communication, not combat. They carried documents, maps, and equipment that could tip the scales of survival. Yet every step they took was measured, deliberate, aware that one misstep could draw a soldier's weapon or the attention of an enemy patrol. Inside the temporary command posts, the tension was no less suffocating. Officers huddled over maps that had been rendered meaningless by the speed of retreat. Reports arrived in fragments, some hand-scribbled, some partially burned. Some intercepted from enemy channels, forcing decisions to be made on speculation rather than facts. Every microsecond carried consequences. A misread message might send a unit into a minefield. A delayed order could doom an entire retreating column. In one field hospital, a nurse pressed herself against a wall, bandaging a soldier whose leg had been shattered by artillery. The cries of pain mingled with the relentless pounding of distant guns. A radio crackled overhead, delivering a fragmented directive. Hold the line. Evacuation postponed. Code red. Repeat code red. And then silence. Meanwhile, on the roads outside, chaos took on a physical, almost tangible form. Mud-caked vehicles slipped into ditches, overturning in ways that threw men against metal and earth alike. Horses, once used for transport, panicked in the flashes of flares, trampling medical supplies and scattering the wounded. Soldiers shouted, their voices lost in the din of exploding shells and screaming tires. Female operators moved through these hazards with calculated urgency, clinging to their assignments. Yet every instinct screamed that survival was no longer about orders. It was about instinct, timing, and luck. One operator froze for a heartbeat as a shadow flitted across the muddy ridge. German officer, a civilian, or enemy patrol. She couldn't tell, and that moment of indecision was enough to bring the memory of the warning back to her mind. If you survive, never talk about it. At headquarters, the tension escalated in a different, more insidious way. Maps were overlaid with conflicting intelligence. Reports from the front contradicted one another, creating a fog of uncertainty that paralyzed decision-making. Analysts whispered about intercepted messages, snippets of text that hinted at captures and disappearances that were never logged, never officially recorded. One young officer muttered under his breath that the information didn't make sense. Every report involving women ends in blacked-out pages, or nothing at all. The directive to do not debrief, do not document, do not ask hung like a specter over every decision. Meanwhile, outside, the chaos continued unabated. Flares illuminated mud, smoke, and terrified faces for split-second glimpses, revealing soldiers frozen in indecision, commanders shouting orders that no one could follow, and women auxiliaries pressed against walls or ducking behind wreckage, listening to secrets that might cost them everything. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, tension and confusion became physical forces. Units collided. Misread orders caused friendly fire incidents. Miscommunications sent troops charging into abandoned villages. The women, moving from post to post, witnessed it all with a mix of horror and calculation. Some whispered notes to each other about movements, others memorized code phrases, all while the threat of capture or annihilation pressed down. In one brief flash, a vehicle overturned nearby, throwing a wounded soldier into the mud. The operator instinctively reached out to pull him up, almost revealing her own position. A flare exploded overhead, illuminating a line of soldiers advancing in the wrong direction, their shadows long and monstrous against the ruined landscape. Chaos was no longer merely a backdrop. It had become a living entity, unpredictable, cruel, and omnipresent. But layered on top of the physical chaos was something far more sinister. The knowledge that some forces were operating behind the scenes, unseen. The captured women were being observed, their every move potentially recorded, their memories considered threats in themselves. Orders filtered down from headquarters to ensure nothing escaped documentation. Yet paradoxically, key details were being deliberately erased. Every micro-event, the burned report, the intercepted radio. The soldier frozen in hesitation added to a growing sense that the chaos was being manipulated. The operators and medics felt it intuitively. The front lines were collapsing, not just due to enemy fire, but because some unseen mechanism ensured that certain truths would never come to light in this environment. Small moments of heroism emerged amid terror. A medic dragged a wounded officer out of the mud under enemy fire. A radio operator scrambled to repair a broken transmitter, knowing that the message she sent could save hundreds or mark them for death. Yet even these acts of courage carried risk. The night seemed endless, each passing second folding over itself, amplifying fear and confusion. And through it all, the warning echoed in the back of every captured woman's mind. If you survive, never speak of what you saw. By the end of this phase, units were scattered, commanders exhausted, and women auxiliaries pressed into hidden corners. Alive yet aware that the true danger, the one that had not yet revealed itself, was not enemy artillery, not retreating troops, not even the chaos of the battlefield itself. The real threat was the secret behind the capture, the unknown force that ensured silence, obedience, and forgetfulness. And as dawn threatened to break over the ruined landscape, everyone on the ground felt it. This night, this chaos, was only the beginning. Something far larger, far more terrifying, was coming. Asterisk, by the time dawn began to hint at the horizon, the chaos had only intensified. The battlefield, once defined by broken terrain and scattered units, now seemed alive with unseen forces manipulating every move. Enemy patrols advanced with a precision that defied prior intelligence. Every retreating column stumbled into hazards previously unnoticed, as if the front lines themselves were conspiring against the Germans. Soldiers moved like pawns, reacting to orders that seemed both urgent and meaningless. Radios crackled with garbled messages, some repeating the same ominous phrase, "Do not debrief. Do not document. Do not ask." The words, once distant and cryptic, now pressed against the minds of those who heard them, amplifying fear into near paralysis amid the growing chaos. The female auxiliaries navigated a deadly labyrinth of mud, fire, and metal. Each step was a gamble between life and death. One radio operator, carrying a packet of code books vital to the command's understanding of enemy movements, ducked into the remains of a bombed-out farmhouse, heart hammering in her chest as a shell landed yards away, splintering wood and sending shards into the earth around her. The momentary relief was shattered by a sudden commotion outside, approaching footsteps. Boots on rubble, voices in harsh tones that could have belonged to friend or foe. Her hands shook as she keyed the transmitter, sending a hurried message in hopes that someone, anyone, would intercept it. The reply never came. She knew then that the next few minutes would determine not just her survival, but the fate of those depending on her intelligence. Elsewhere, a medic clutched a stretcher carrying a wounded officer. Weaving through abandoned streets and shell craters, explosions flared too close, sending dirt and smoke into her face. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed with exertion, but she moved forward, knowing that hesitation meant death. Around her, chaos layered upon chaos, vehicles overturned in mud, soldiers arguing over orders that contradicted one another, flares illuminating enemy scouts moving silently along the ridges. Every human reaction, fear, disbelief, desperation, was magnified, creating a living tapestry of tension that made each decision feel impossible. Back at a temporary command post, officers struggled to maintain any semblance of strategy. Maps were almost meaningless. Intelligence reports contradicted themselves, often within the same document. Analysts noticed inconsistencies that were too deliberate to ignore. Blacked-out names, redacted sequences, and references to captured women that vanished without explanation. A junior officer whispered to his superior, voice trembling, "Sir, these reports, they're not just incomplete, they've been altered. Someone wants us to miss something." Senior officer's face remained unreadable, but his eyes reflected the same unease. There was a sense that history itself was bending under the weight of events that no one outside these command rooms would ever understand. And somewhere in the shadows, the women who had been captured or who were at risk of capture felt the presence of this invisible hand guiding the battlefield in ways too sinister to name. As ours dragged on, small, desperate acts of courage emerged amid the horror. A medic ignored an incoming shell to pull a comrade to safety. A young operator scrambled across open ground, dodging artillery fire to repair a broken transmitter that could save hundreds. Yet every act of bravery carried risk. A misstep could be fatal. And every observer, enemy or unseen, watched with deliberate intent. The captured women, pressed into corners, hiding behind rubble, and slipping through alleys, became witnesses to events that would never appear in official records. Their silence was not only demanded, it was enforced by circumstances they could barely comprehend. The emotional stakes escalated alongside the physical ones. Messages arrived too late, orders contradicted prior directives, and promises between soldiers, medics, and officers were broken by forces beyond their control. Betrayals real or perceived flashed through the night. Units abandoned comrades. Friendly fire claimed lives, and whispers of secret operations circulated among those who could hear them. One young woman, her hands stained with mud and blood, recalled a phrase whispered by a fellow POW months earlier: "If you survive, forget it all." At that moment, it seemed less like advice and more like a prophecy. Because what unfolded in the next hour was something no human should have been expected to endure, and yet, somehow they did. Then, in the midst of escalating disorder, came a moment that would define the entire sequence. An enemy patrol, unexpected, precise, and terrifyingly calm, emerged from the fog. They moved with military coordination that suggested prior knowledge of the terrain, avoiding minefields, artillery fire, and even the scattered German units as if guided by intelligence no one in the command post had received. The women, frozen in corners and crumbling buildings, could only watch, hearts pounding, as the patrol approached positions that were supposed to be secure. A decision had to be made in an instant: move, hide, or risk capture. And every option carried consequences too heavy to bear. It was here that heroism and desperation collided. Officers made impossible choices, ordering retreats that might doom their own units to save others, sending young medics into open streets to deliver supplies and risking lives to retrieve critical intelligence. The women, caught between the chaos of the front lines and the invisible hand enforcing silence, became both observers and actors in a drama that blurred survival and compliance. Each heartbeat, each decision, each fleeting second mattered. The world itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would survive, who would vanish, and what secrets would remain hidden. Finally, the climax of this step arrived not with a single explosion or a decisive maneuver, but with a convergence of events so improbable it could only be described as fate. Orders collided, units were cut off, messages intercepted and destroyed, and the enemy maneuvered with uncanny foresight. In the midst of it all, the women pressed on, navigating the impossible, making decisions that would echo in their memories forever. And then, just as the battlefield seemed to reach its breaking point, time itself seemed to pause, as if the universe were granting a brief, fleeting chance to witness what no historian would later explain. In that suspended moment, every element, the chaos, the fear, the heroism, the betrayal, the invisible forces enforcing silence, coalesced into a perfect storm. For those who survived, the experience would haunt them for decades. For those who vanished, the world would never know what became of them. And for everyone watching, even through fragmented archives and reports, the question remained: what did they see, and why were they warned never to speak of it? And then in a moment, no historian could explain. Everything changed. The battlefield had quieted, but the silence was anything but peaceful. Smoke hung low over shattered villages. Mud-choked roads were strewn with abandoned equipment and overturned vehicles, a haunting testament to the chaos of the last hours. Those who had survived moved slowly, limping through the ruins, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. Commanders counted losses, patched together fragmentary reports, and tried to make sense of a night that seemed to defy logic. Yet no document fully captured what had happened. Names were missing. Reports were incomplete. Witnesses were either gone or silent. The female auxiliary SOs who had been captured, those who had hidden, those who had witnessed the horror, emerged from the shadows, alive yet changed. Some carried injuries, others carried secrets heavier than any pack of supplies. One operator, clutching a tattered radio and burned documents, stumbled into the temporary headquarters. She was met not with congratulations, but with quiet scrutiny, an understanding in the eyes of the officers that something had occurred that no one could explain, and that certain truths would never be written down. Diaries, letters, and personal notes later revealed a pattern. Every woman who survived carried the same warning, the same unspoken burden. Do not speak of it. Do not write. Do not remember in detail. The aftermath was not just physical. It was psychological, and for many, it was a lifetime of tension, avoidance, and secrecy. Some women destroyed personal journals or shredded correspondence, fearing that even a single word could unravel something that authorities wanted hidden. Medical officers recorded anomalies in behavior: trembling hands, haunted eyes, refusal to speak about specific hours or locations. Yet the world at large remained oblivious. Historians pieced together fragments from official archives, but even these were sanitized, redacted, or mysteriously incomplete. One document might mention a captured female operator. The next, that same section was blank, replaced with cryptic annotations. Observation terminated. Do not reference. And still, whispers persisted. In letters discovered decades later, survivors hinted at experiences that were seen but not understood, encounters that blurred the line between strategy, espionage, and something far more secretive. Eyewitness accounts, when they appeared, were carefully worded, partial, and hesitant. One woman, speaking anonymously to a historian, said simply, "I survived, but survival came with a condition. I cannot explain what I witnessed. It is not for anyone to know." Her words echoed the warning whispered among the captured. Survival carried a price beyond pain or injury. It carried silence, obedience, and the knowledge of things the world was never meant to see. Files that were eventually declassified revealed hints, but no full story. Names were changed, locations blacked out, sequences of events partially reconstructed, but the heart of the mystery remained intact. Questions remained unanswered. What truly happened to the women captured alive? Why were they specifically warned never to speak? And what did they see, hear, or endure that was deemed so dangerous that history itself would be edited to hide it? Scholars, archivists, and amateur historians could only speculate. Photographs showed faces, sometimes blurred or cropped, but never the truth behind the eyes. Diaries offered fragments of thoughts, but key passages were always missing. As if the writers themselves had been conditioned to forget. Decades passed. The world moved on. Victory parades, reconstruction, treaties, and textbooks chronicled battles, strategies, and political shifts, but rarely mentioned the women who had vanished. Survived or witnessed the unrecorded horrors? In the silence of archives, in the locked filing cabinets of military intelligence, in the margins of classified reports, the truth lingered. Those who had been captured carried it in memory, but even memory was incomplete, unreliable, enforced by the weight of warning and fear. Letters discovered decades later suggested a haunting pattern. Every woman who returned alive lived with the same secret. Every word carefully measured, every memory carefully guarded, and the final chilling detail remained: the world outside would never know. Even historians, poring over documents, could not reconstruct what had truly occurred during those fateful hours. The captured had seen something so profound, so dangerous to reveal that it became invisible to official record, erased from reports, and buried in silence. Because whatever those women experienced, whatever they had witnessed after being captured alive, was a secret so carefully guarded that the truth about it remains locked in archives to this day. And even now, decades later, the question lingers: what did she see that night? And why was she warned so starkly, so deliberately not to speak? The answer is still hidden.